And welcome to this edition of IIEA Insights with me, Dan O'Brien. The EU may not always engage the public and the media, but for its member states, it is at the centre of their statecraft in many, if not most, policy areas. Indeed, some of its competences, such as state aid rules, are more centralised than full federations such as the United States. But from economic matters such as state aids to migration policy to the primary function of any state, security and defence, how the EU functions is being fundamentally rethought. In a slightly different format today, our three speakers, one from politics, one from academia, and one from the think tank world, will assess where Ireland stands on these many changing issues at play over a period of 7 minutes as introductory remarks before we have our more traditional conversation. They'll also look at what positions Ireland should take and how its alliance building is evolving, particularly in the context of the EU without the UK. Joining us today are Dr. Eoin Drea, a senior researcher at Wilfried Martens Centre for European Studies in Brussels, Senator Michael McDowell, who has seen the EU function from the inside as Justice Minister, and Dr. Kathryn Simpson, Associate Professor at Keele University and leading academic scholar on Ireland-EU relations. Thank you all for joining us today. So with that, and without further ado, we'll go in our usual alphabetical order. So Eoin, would you like to kick off for the first 7 minutes?
Yes, thanks, Dan. And a pleasure to be here today. Thanks for the invitation. Okay, so the title of this event and discussion is, does Ireland have a Europe strategy? Well, the short answer is that while Ireland has multiple strategies, we've got the Department of Foreign Affairs Statement of Strategy, we've got a strategy for increasing Irish representation in the EU. But I would say, based on my decade of experience on the ground here in Brussels, is that these strategies appear completely irrelevant when it comes to actually engaging in how Brussels works. And I'll just limit my opening remarks to the following 3 points. First, our engagement with the EU is increasingly inconsistent, based on short-term objectives, and lacks all strategic foresight. To borrow that terrible phrase from business consulting, we are not very good at horizon scanning. So what's the reality? We're a small member state, we're a peripheral member state. Our two most important trading partners will probably never be a part of the EU in the foreseeable future, the US and the UK. We're now a net contributor to the EU budget, yet we're not in Schengen due to our land border with the UK. We have a very different economic model to the continental economies. Our public spending as a percentage to GDP is about 28%, which compares to an EU average probably in the mid to low 40s. And in some states like France and Belgium, it's well over 50%. And we have allowed ourselves for the second time in less than 2 decades to become dramatically exposed to concentration risk. In the Celtic Tiger, it was to the financial institutions, and now it is to US pharma and tech companies. And when I was thinking about all of this, I thought about what the former Minister for State for European Affairs, Lucinda Creighton, wrote in a book marking Ireland's 50-year anniversary of membership of the EU, when she noted that while the operating context in Brussels has fundamentally changed, the prioritisation and approach to the relationship by the Irish government has not. And the reality, as you know, hits me in the face every couple of weeks here in Brussels, is that our credibility has been fundamentally damaged over the past decade across a whole suite of issues. Data protection and tech policy generally, security and defence, corporate taxation, we all know the Apple judgment. The second point I would raise, which I think might be interesting for discussion, is that we increasingly seem to have no coherent vision for the type of EU which would best serve Irish objectives. Because in a sense, our objectives themselves are not consistent. After the bailout period, we attempted for a short while to run with the Hanseatic League, the frugal, to prove that we were, economically responsible. Along came COVID and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and suddenly we were for a bigger EU budget, joint borrowing, and an enlarged EU, including Ukraine. Yet, while we support these positions, we simultaneously oppose corporate tax harmonisation and joint borrowing for defence. Now, each of these issues, even individually, would have a huge impact on the Irish economy, which doesn't seem to, factor into the high-level planning here in Brussels. Just to give you one example, should Ukraine come into the EU, the initial modelling I've seen from the European Commission and the European Council would suggest that Ireland's common agricultural policy payments would be reduced by between 30 and 40%. And I can tell you that would be the end of many a family farm in Ireland. So if this is Ireland having a strategy, I would hate to see Ireland without having a strategy. The second point here that I think would be remiss of me not to raise is the issue of security and defence and what is perceived in Brussels as Ireland's increasing obsession with the Middle East and Palestine. Why is this the case? Because quite simply in Brussels, we have no credibility when it comes to security and defence issues. We spend 0.2% of GDP and we are unable to patrol the 16% of the EU's external sea waters. We depend on the Royal Air Force to police our airspace, and the Irish government, and Michael can correct me if I'm wrong, is currently fighting in the courts against independent Senator Gerald Crockwell's case to allow more information on this agreement to be brought into the public domain. We have zero to offer the EU when it comes to the security of Europe as a whole. Yet we continue to pontificate quite loudly on the Middle Eastern issue. Increasingly, we are seeing in Brussels as reveling in the moral high ground of harmless humanitarianism. A final point which may come up later, which I won't delve into in my opening remarks, is the issue of industrial and state aid, which, given Ireland's position as an economy largely dependent on FDI from the United States, could have potentially huge impacts. My very final point is a very practical point, and it's about our engagement, our practical engagement in Brussels on the ground. We seem to finally have woken up about how we are struggling to replace Irish EU officials in the European institutions. But I'd just like to highlight the following, and perhaps, people can draw their own judgment as to whether this is a great strategy to have for a small peripheral member state. We offer no formal guidance or support to existing Irish stagiaires or interns in the EU institutions if they are seeking to gain more permanent positions. And that's unlike many member states, such as France, who have a very coordinated and sophisticated system. We have no formal strategy for placing Irish EU officials in the cabinets of incoming commissioners. I just spoke with several Irish officials in the Commission who are attempting to get places in the cabinets, again doing it without any support from Dublin. We provide no detailed support or training centres for Irish citizens wanting to sit the EPSO exams for entrance into the EU institutions. And we refuse to acknowledge our language issues with regard to continental languages, both for entry into the European institutions and for promotion where enhanced language skills are required. I was shocked by how the introduction of Irish as an official language was portrayed by Dublin, where even in official communications it was portrayed that a great battle had been won, when, as we all know, linguistic diversity is the basis of the European Union. Ireland could have been made a full working language of the EU at any time since 1973, and the derogation that Ireland had since 2007 was actually at Ireland's request, because we simply didn't have the qualified Irish speakers available. I would argue that the Irish Perm Rep should be redesignated the most important Irish diplomatic mission abroad, given our membership of the European Union and everything that's at stake. We need to have a focus on career long-term European experts within the civil service, and not the placement to those in Brussels on 3 to 5 year contracts, which has become the norm and which has allowed us a siloisation of expertise at EU affairs. And I'll finish by quoting Sir Anthony Esmond, who was a former Fine Gael TD for Waterford or Wexford, I believe. In the 1970, he was speaking at the Dáil about when the debates were raging about whether Ireland should join the then EEC. And he said that Ireland should negotiate with Brussels as a sovereign state, even though we may be giving away a small degree of some of our sovereignty. But at least let us fight our own battle on Irish principles and Irish economics. Unfortunately, from what I've seen in Brussels over the last 10 years, we have dramatically failed to live up to that in treaty. Thank you.
As expected, I'm not on mute. Good. And I should have mentioned, of course, that the Martens Centre is the think tank of the European People's Party, which is to which Fine Gael is affiliated to. Our next speaker in alphabetical order is Senator McDowell. The floor is yours, Senator. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Dan, and hello to fellow contributors and to participants in today's event. The first thing I'd like to say is that I am underwhelmed by the charge that Ireland lacks credibility in the European Union. For this very reason, I don't know what the credibility of Belgium is. I don't know what the credibility of Malta is. I don't know what the credibility of Cyprus is. We are a small country, and we are geographically peripheral, as has been mentioned. But there are, but we have our own interests, and in some respects, we are outliers. To take two examples, firstly, in relation to defence, which has been mentioned, Ireland has actually, as part of the process of getting the Irish people to go along with the European treaties, actually written into its constitution that it will not participate in European defence. I mean, it's an absolute ban on it happening. So that may be may circumscribe people's view about Ireland and Europe. But Ireland has, the Irish people's position is they don't want to participate in a common defence. The funny thing is that the Irish government has successively, for the last decade, run down Irish defence capacities dramatically. Just to give you an example, there's less than 7,000 people in the Irish Defence Forces now, where there was 12,000 in the early 2000s. We're in a position that we have declining capacity, even from the limited security levels that we envisage. We established a Commission on Defence Expenditure, which had put up 3 models. We went for the middle model, which was designed to be the preferred model by the terms of reference of that commission. And the result now is that we are, as far as I can see, hugely under provided for in defence, and we're going to have to remedy that. But it's not really, I mean, and the point that was mentioned about my colleague, Senator Gerard Crockwell, and our arrangement for aerial defence with the RAF and with the United Kingdom is well made. Ireland is acknowledging that it doesn't have a sophisticated air force that could protect Irish or European airspace in a threat originating in Ireland. We're not in a position at the moment to adequately patrol our fishery or security matters in terms of our maritime areas. So I take that point. But the question that I'm listening to Eoin making a different point, and that is that we don't seem to have a coherent vision of where Europe should go and where Ireland wants it to go. I think most Irish people are content with the idea of Europe as a partnership of member states sharing some sovereignty and not sharing other sovereignty. I don't think there's a demand in domestic politics in Ireland for someone to articulate a future vision of Europe. And issues such as, for instance, in the past, whether Turkey was or was not eligible, or the extent to which the Balkan states should or should not be brought into full membership, and when, and issues such as whether Ukraine should be offered full membership and what the consequence of that would be for our CAP income in Ireland. Those are matters on which, to a large extent, Ireland's attitude is irrelevant, in the sense that, I mean, if Ireland took a strong view about Serbia joining the European Union, or if Ireland took a strong view about Ukraine one way or the other, it doesn't really matter. We have to be pragmatic about it. Ireland is not going to exercise a veto if the rest of Europe wishes to admit any of those member states. But what I do believe is important is that there isn't, and when the Irish Times many years ago did research on this topic, there isn't an appetite for a strong federalist, integrationist European vision among the Irish electorate. If you scratch the surface, they are content with the partnership approach that exists at the moment. And the absence of what Eoin refers to as a coherent vision it reflects Irish pragmatism on Europe. It is what it is. It may be developing in one way or another. We may or may not be in a position to contribute significantly to that. But my view is that whereas people talk about being at the center of the European Union, and you hear that kind of rhetoric spoken by Irish politicians, the simple fact is that we are in a complex situation. We are in a common travel area with the United Kingdom. Brexit has had very significant implications for Ireland. What happens in the United States in respect of FDI is hugely important to Ireland. And concentration on those relationships is not, in my view, in any way unrealistic, and it doesn't suggest that we are somehow less European. We have to deal with the real relationships that really affect us, and they include the European Union, the member states of the European Union, but they also include the United Kingdom, and they also include North America, in particular the United States. So, I mean, I just wonder, when we sort of demand rhetorically that Ireland should begin to articulate a vision for Europe, are we really, is that purely rhetorical? I mean, for instance, we do have interests in common with the Northern European, the Hanseatic states. Sometimes we do have interests in common with France and Germany of a particular kind. And, you know, these are kind of issues which having a kind of a preordained attitude doesn't really suit the day-to-day business of looking after our national interests and looking after and seeing that we don't lose too much influence in the European Union's affairs where our interests are concerned. One point that I would make, for instance, at the moment is in relation to immigration. The European Union has, over the last 20 years, asserted a desire to establish an EU competence on migration, immigration, and asylum seeking. We've written into the Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedom the guarantees in relation to asylum as part of the fundamental law of the Union. By doing so, we've handed to the Court of Justice of the European Union very significant powers to determine what member states can and cannot do in respect of asylum seeking, the rights of asylum seekers, the methods of dealing with them, and the control of migratory flows in the European Union. Now, I would argue that the European Union has not been successful on the whole question of migration and asylum seeking. It's a phenomenon which is causing huge problems for the European Union. The fact that Germany has imposed border controls, the fact that Holland is now, the Netherlands are now contemplating on an emergency basis opting out of the EU asylum process. The fact that there are problems with the Visegrad states arising from a difference of opinion between their populist leaders on the one hand, or in the past, not all of them are not populist now, but their populist leaders and the views espoused originally by Angela Merkel on migration, those are problems. And if anybody is being honest, the European Union did not make a good fist of migration policy. The Mediterranean is deeply problematical. Burden sharing is deeply problematical. And Ireland in particular, because of our common travel area, the open border in Northern Ireland, we are as regards migration, we're receiving the highest asylum seeking rate per head of the population of any member state in the European Union, even though we are at the periphery and probably the most difficult to arrive at without traveling through safe countries. So my point is very simply this, that if the European Union, that there are problems at the moment, there are tensions within Europe, but Ireland's position, for instance, on migration is one where we have to look to our own self-interest and to our own unique circumstances. And talking about a greater Europe, a coherent vision for the European Union on topics such as that, really is at the level of rhetoric and impracticality. Europe has failed on the migration issue. Europe has failed. It simply hasn't handled migration well and asylum seeking well. And that is going to translate into Irish attitudes to the European Union.
Great. Senator, thank you for that contribution. We certainly have teed up a robust debate for the final few minutes of this event coming up. Kathryn, floor is yours. Thank you.
Super. Thank you very much to Dan and the IEA for the invitation to speak to you today about Ireland-EU relations, a topic which has been pretty much the focal point of my research for a decade and a half now. Thank you to my fellow panellists and for sharing your thoughts so far, and to those of you who've taken the time out of very busy schedules to attend today. I'm going to focus on three themes that aim to answer the question that is posed to us today on does Ireland have a Europe strategy? And the first theme is alliance building in the EU post-Brexit. Post-Brexit, Ireland's alliances across the EU have not so much shifted, but have become far more dynamic and issue dependent. And to echo Senator McDowell's comments, Ireland's approach to alliance building in the EU has been one of pragmatism, with Ireland aligning with EU member states on a policy level rather than a nation state level. And this alliance building and essentially a divergence between, I would argue, Ireland and the UK was evident long before Brexit. Common EU interests between Ireland and the UK began to decline for a significant amount of time ahead of the 2016 referendum. And Ireland has therefore been aligning with Nordic EU member states, Denmark, Finland, Norway, Sweden, on key issues such as trade, education and culture. And this is reflected in a variety of strategy documents by the DFA, in particular, the Nordic strategy. The second theme, and in line, I think, with Ireland building this Europe strategy on issue dependence, if you will, is Ireland's alliance building in kind of thematic alliance building, if so to speak, to protect those Irish interests. So again, Ireland is aligned with the Benelux countries in opposition to digital tax and into taxation policy more broadly. We know tax policy is a very contentious issue. It's often strongly associated with sovereignty. We know that Ireland's tax policy regime has been repeatedly met with disapproval from the EU since the early 2000s, when the Irish government was criticised for its refusal to dampen the Celtic Tiger and for tax concessions to foreign investors, which were regarded by the European Commission as kind of breaking the spirit of the European single market, and I would argue still are. I think as well, the most recent decision by the European Court of Justice on the Apple tax case highlights the really complex state of global tax competition. And this is also an area which is moving to a more internationalized kind of policy space rather than an EU policy space as well. And maybe that is something that Ireland needs to navigate a little bit more strategically in the kind of years ahead. Digital policy is another policy area where those thematic alliance building has taken place with EU member states in Central and Eastern Europe, as well as the Nordic states. We know all EU member states are part of the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. But again, we know that there are weaknesses in this approach which Ireland is taking. We have seen conflict between Ireland and the EU on these policy issues, specifically tax policy and digital policy. And I also think when you look at strategy documents, there is sparse detail around if the approach to alliance building is going to be policy oriented, then how is that alliance building approach going to be designed? And I think the third and final theme is, which is really key to this, is the reset in Ireland-UK relations. Brexit not only destabilised British-Irish relations, but it had a detrimental impact on the relationship between and on these islands. And that cannot be, I think, downplayed in any shape or form. Brexit is essentially a barrier building exercise. It is the opposite of European integration. European integration is something which Ireland has been strongly committed to since it joined in 1973, despite no votes to Nice in 2001 and to Lisbon in 2008. The Irish electorate and Irish people are still very strongly pro-European with a pro-integrationist attitude. And I think the finalising of the EU-UK withdrawal agreement, the full implementation of the Windsor Framework, and a change in political leadership in the UK has marked a new era of cooperation, a friendship between Ireland and Britain. We've seen this evidence by kind of reciprocal visits between the Taoiseach and Prime Minister Starmer. It is welcome from, I think, a political, an economic, a social and a cultural perspective. And it's also fully embedded within strategy documents kind of up until 25 and beyond. So to really kind of bring everything together, I do think Ireland has a Europe strategy. I think it's dynamic, I think it's pragmatic, and I think it's issue dependent. As I said, Ireland is a committed EU member state. Recent opinion poll data from March this year from European Movement Ireland shows 88% of people in Ireland still supports EU membership. Okay, it's a decline from the heady heights of 92 and 93% in 2018 and 2019, but I would argue that that was kind of almost inflated because of the Brexit period we were going through. But there are real significant challenges, I think, in that future Ireland-EU relationship. Because if we're going to adopt this policy-based alliance-building approach, significant policy areas and issues loom large. So things like taxation, digital policy, foreign and security policy, which we've touched upon, climate policy as well. Ireland is a laggard in this area, and the EU Green Deal, and health policy. And I think in these challenging policy areas, Ireland really needs to robustly develop, but also commit to a strategy of, I would argue, engagement, robust engagement, rather than this kind of semi-slight avoidance of difficult issues. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Kathryn. Okay, great to get very different views. Let me do a round of questions to each of you. Oh, and how do you respond to the Senator's view that small countries just don't have much influence anyway, and they therefore can't strategize? There's no point in strategizing. It's more about tactical flexibility on issues, on individual issues. And also, in terms of the Migration Pact, do you think Ireland should sign up to that or opt out of it?
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, I'm going to I think I'm surprising even myself when I say that I agree with a good proportion of what Michael says. We are an outlier. And I do believe that the vast majority of Irish people, there is no demand for a federalist EU in Ireland or for, considerably deeper integration in every area. And I was very heartened to hear him mention that, the political rhetoric that Irish politicians continue to use about us being at the heart of Europe is it actually acts as an impediment. My difference is I think we've reached different conclusions here, because I would say that our outlier status makes it even more important that we develop a coherent strategy to achieve our objectives, which should be single market, transatlantic relations and competitiveness. And this is where I will come to answer your questions about member states. Small member states, yes, we're not going to veto Ukraine entering the EU, but we could send a message that we will, push for a derogation limiting free movement of labour for 7 years, like France and every other member state did following the enlargements of 2002 and 2004. So it's all about give and take, and it's all about setting out what your red lines are. Unfortunately, I think Kathryn hit the nail on the head when she said that a lot of this comes down to the avoidance. We still have this streak in Irish public policy which sees that we need to be liked by everybody on the European stage, that we're the Irish and we're everybody's friends. But I would just say that not every restaurant offers an a la carte menu, and I firmly believe that the days of a la carte pragmatism in the EU are coming to an end when you hear what French and German and Italian policymakers are talking about here in Brussels. And the second question about the migration pact, Michael is absolutely correct. The EU has completely failed on migration. I think we should opt in like we have done to the migration pact, but I think we shouldn't be afraid of enacting extra border regulations or checks or whatever's needed. We're not in the Schengen area. That is a huge advantage, or it should be a huge advantage. And I think what we need to do is we need to liaise a lot more with our counterparts in London on how to control the migration issue. It's a common travel area. It's also a significant security issue for the United Kingdom in terms of having a common travel area with Ireland. And I think we should acknowledge and engage in that. Thanks.
Good, thank you, Eoin. Michael, on the issue, you raised the issue of interests and the primacy of interests. Just on one issue, that Ireland was part of that frugal Northern European free trading, not a bigger budget in the EU. And in the early days of COVID, when the Southern Europeans, mostly Southern European grouping, pushed for collective debt, Ireland shifted its position. What is Ireland's interests in terms of a bigger EU budget? We're now a net contributor. Is it in Ireland's interest to have a bigger budget, to issue Euro bonds, which we don't benefit from very much? This money has gone to Southern Europe. It hasn't come to us. We're going to have to pay for it. What are Ireland's interests, in your view, around a bigger EU budget and more common debt issuance?
Well, it all depends, I suppose. A bigger European budget as an end in itself is not something which is possible to have a kind of a preordained attitude to it. I mean, the size of the European budget really should be, the merits of the size of the European budget should be determined by what it's being spent on. And from an Irish point of view, whether it advances our interests significantly or not. It seems to me that yes, our relationship with the Hanseatic countries was also based on a desire to slow down the integrationist activity which was happening on the Paris Berlin axis, and the point that has been made just a few months ago about that French and German and Italian policy makers in Brussels are developing policies which we should be aware of, perhaps. But I mean, the point I would make in respect of that is that I don't see that France is becoming more and more federalist or more and more integrationist. It very much depends on who's in charge in the Elysee Palace. I think that Germany is not as integrationist as it was. I think that the obviously Giorgia Meloni is not a great integrationist in Europe either. So if you look at what's happening in the member states, I don't think that there's sort of a demand for a much enlarged EU budget. EU spending on defence, we can't veto other people's spending on defence if we're not going to participate in it ourselves. And if it's going to be financed by defence bonds, I don't think that Ireland really has a moral right, given our precarious security position ourselves, to impede the other member states from going down that route and raising money to spend it on defence. I mean, if we're opting out, which we are obliged to do constitutionally at present, from participation in EU defence, I think that perhaps there's a very strong argument for saying that we should not stand in the way of EU budgetary measures designed to enhance defence expenditure, especially viewing the possibility of a Trump presidency and what Putin is up to in Ukraine.
But just to be clear, Senator, and as a legal person as well, you feel that Ireland constitutionally could not participate in common issuance of debt for this explicit purpose of defence spending in Europe?
No, what's written into our constitution is that Ireland may not participate in a common EU defence. That's written into our constitution since one of the, I think the second last referendum, it was inserted into our constitution. It's not generally known, but it's not just simply that we want to opt out or that we want to have the right to be neutral. We've actually written it into our constitution that Ireland will not participate in a common EU defence. So if that's the case, it doesn't stop us. It doesn't require us to object the European Union raising money collectively for defence purposes, but it means that whatever a common EU defence is something that we have to remain out of unless we have a referendum.
And you think that includes joint issuance of debt explicitly for the use of defending Europe?
No, I don't. I think that the way the constitutional prohibition in Ireland is phrased, it implies that we have no objection to there being a common EU defence as long as we're not in it, and financing it therefore is something I don't think over which we have any real right to object if the other member states wish to do that.
Okay, Kathryn, that brings us nicely to public opinion. And you mentioned that, a lot of the comparative public opinion polling shows Ireland is in favour of most more integrationist policies. But I do wonder, is that a mile wide and an inch deep?
I don't accept that. I mean, the European bodies in Ireland ask questions which seem to elicit those answers. But I don't think there is a strong desire for further integration in Ireland.
Okay, can I go to Kathryn? Kathryn, on that topic and the public opinion stuff, Michael says he doubts some of that public opinion polling. And I have to say, I'm sort of, when I see Ireland as the most integrationist in many areas, and including in defence and common security policy, I do wonder if it's a mile wide and an inch deep. People are more inclined to say they're in favour, but actually we've had two referendums that went down, voted down. What do you specifically think or generally think around that area? And if it came to it and we'd have to put a referendum to people about joining a common debt issuance for defence, how would you see such a referendum going?
Yeah, so I think one of the, when you look at, and again, whether it's snapshot polling in Ireland or even standard Eurobarometer data, so the long-standing kind of large N since 1973 that tracks public opinion in Ireland on issues, it is always way above the EU average of around 50%, which is around the 50% mark. But one caveat to that is that and what often goes under acknowledged in Ireland is that there's a knowledge deficit about the EU in Ireland. So while generally speaking, yes, we're in favor, Ireland is in favor and has that pro-integrationist attitude, I think there is definitely something to be held about how deep does that support for European integration go. And again, going back to what I was kind of said in my top head comments about the pragmatism on kind of Ireland's relationship with the EU, that's always been the case. It's always been a pragmatic approach. It's always been kind of, in particular around economic interest, that is always the stance they've taken. So I think it's somewhere in between. I think it's really, really difficult to try and judge how pro-European in some aspects and how far that integration goes in Ireland. But again, data is always, it is a comparison to any other EU member state, Ireland is the most pro-integrationist. On your second question, Dan, around defence, I think that's something that European Movement Ireland and the opinion polling data that they've been doing yearly for probably kind of since 2013 in particular. But over the last couple of years, you've seen a shift in quite significantly, I think, around the issue of security and defence. So in the latest poll, when people were asked, do they think Ireland should be part of increased EU defence and security cooperation, 49% of people in Ireland said that they do. And that is actually higher than any of the other data that we have seen. So there is definitely a shift. If that was go to a referendum, it's not a majority, but there is certainly something that is to be said. And I think it ties in with the wider things we're seeing in continental Europe around the invasion of Ukraine, and kind of the necessity really to tackle that. And I also think it's linked to the wider migration argument and how the EU has handled that as well.
Okay, look, we've hit the just over the 45-minute mark. I'd like to thank everyone, our speakers today, and the many people who attended online. This will be available on a podcast later today, probably, or early tomorrow, so you can listen back if you missed any of it. But again, thanks to the speakers, and have a good afternoon, everyone.